Belle Starr's only documented crime was stealing a horse in 1882. One horse, one conviction, 6 months in prison. And when she walked out of the House of Correction in Detroit in 1883, she was arguably the most famous female outlaw in American history, the subject of a national newspaper feature, a woman whose name had become synonymous with the romantic mythology of the lawless West. The gap between one horse theft and the most dangerous woman on the frontier is the story of how American popular culture in the 1880s manufactured a legend out of a woman whose actual criminal record barely merited a footnote, and in doing so, created an image so compelling that it survived her death, survived the debunking of nearly every specific claim made about her, and is still being adapted into films, novels, and television series more than 130 years after the publisher, who invented most of it, put out his 25-cent dime novel on the same day her body was still warm. Myra Maybelle Shirley was born on February 5, 1848, near Carthage, Missouri, the daughter of John Shirley, a prosperous innkeeper and slaveholder, and Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, whose family name connects to the Hatfields of the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud. She grew up in a family with strong Confederate sympathies during a period when Missouri's position along the border between Union and Confederate territory made the Civil War a daily, intimate reality, rather than a distant political conflict. Her older brother, Bud, joined a Confederate guerrilla unit early in the war, riding with forces connected to William Clark Quantrill's Raiders, the same Quantrill's Raiders whose roster would later include figures like Jesse and Frank James and the Younger Brothers. Bud Shirley was killed in 1864, and the family farm at Syene, Texas, became a gathering point for former Confederate guerrillas, rebuilding their lives, or continuing their wartime habits in the chaotic, post-war border country. This is the environment that produced Myra Belle Shirley. Not the romantic Southern belle seeking revenge for a fallen Confederacy that the dime novels invented, but a young woman from a family with genuine connections to some of the most violent men in the post-war borderlands, in a region where the legal system was being constructed in real time and where the line between former guerrilla, legitimate rancher, and active outlaw was genuinely blurry in ways that made it difficult even for contemporaries to know exactly which side of that line any given individual was on at any given moment. She married Jim Reed in 1866, a former member of guerrilla forces who had kept up his criminal activities after the war. Reed was eventually killed in 1874, shot by a member of his own gang. Belle had 2 children by Reed, a daughter she called Pearl, whose paternity she never publicly settled. Legend attributed the child to Cole Younger, which Cole Younger denied and which most historians consider improbable, and a son named Ed. After Reed's death, she spent several years in somewhat reduced circumstances before eventually settling in Indian Territory in the early 1880s. In 1880, she married Sam Starr, a member of the Cherokee Starr clan, a family with extensive involvement in horse stealing, cattle rustling, and whiskey trading in Indian Territory. Their ranch at Younger's Bend on the Canadian River, in what is now eastern Oklahoma, became a known refuge for men wanted by law enforcement. Jesse James reportedly visited and stayed there. Belle later claimed in one account that a slim, quiet man with blinking blue eyes had stayed at the ranch and that she had told Sam not to worry about him because he was an old friend from Missouri. She claimed she never told Sam his name was Jesse James. This is the most credible part of the Belle Starr legend, not because she was a criminal mastermind, but because the geography and social network she occupied genuinely intersected with some of the most wanted men in the country. And providing informal refuge to people on the run from law enforcement was a real activity with real legal risk that real people in Indian Territory engaged in during this period. The territory was a genuine administrative borderland, governed under complex arrangements involving federal courts, tribal governments, and the famous court of Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas, who operated jurisdiction over a vast area with limited resources and who became known as the hanging judge for the volume of capital cases his court processed. In 1882, Belle and Sam Starr were arrested for horse theft, federal offense. They were tried before Judge Parker, convicted and sentenced to 2 terms of 6 months each in the Federal House of Correction in Detroit, Michigan. This is the conviction from which, essentially, the entire documented criminal record of Belle Starr derives. The Oklahoma Historical Society's summary of her documented criminal history is blunt and brief. 1 documented crime, the horse theft of 1882. There are no documented bank robberies, no documented train robberies, no documented stagecoach holdups, no documented murders personally committed by her. The dime novel biography that made her famous attributed all of these to her. The historical record does not. The geography and legal structure of Indian Territory that Belle Starr operated within deserves more context, because it explains why this specific region became the setting for so much outlaw activity in the post-Civil War period, and why the legal situation there was genuinely different from anywhere else in the United States at the time. Indian Territory, roughly corresponding to present-day Oklahoma, had been established through a series of treaties that relocated the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, from their original homelands in the southeast, following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The territory was governed through a combination of a tribal law applied to tribal citizens and federal jurisdiction applied to non-citizens. The complexity of this arrangement created genuine jurisdictional gaps that men on the run from law enforcement in other states exploited deliberately. Federal jurisdiction over non-citizen crimes in Indian Territory was ultimately vested in the Western District of Arkansas, headquartered in Fort Smith, which gave Judge Isaac Parker's court authority over an area of 74,000 square miles with a population spread across remote terrain and limited communication infrastructure. Parker had a relatively small number of deputy marshals attempting to enforce federal law across this enormous area, which meant that in practice, enforcement was patchy and irregular, and that someone like Belle Starr, who operated in the more remote sections of the territory, could maintain a degree of de facto immunity from regular law enforcement attention that would not have been possible in a more densely administered area. This context matters because it explains why the Younger's Bend ranch functioned as a refuge for wanted men in a way that does not require attributing genius-level criminal planning to Belle Starr. She was in a place where the law had limited reach, and she married into a Cherokee family with existing criminal infrastructure, and she lived in an era when providing refuge to people her community considered legitimate, even if the federal government considered them criminals, did not necessarily carry the moral weight it might in other circumstances. The Cherokee Starr family's involvement in horse stealing and other activities reflected a different relationship to property and legitimacy than the federal legal system recognized. Belle Starr was operating within that social world, not directing it from outside as the female mastermind the dime novels invented. Subscribe to Lawless Frontier right now, because the actual mechanics of how the myth was constructed, while her body was still being prepared for burial, are more interesting than any robbery she supposedly committed. Richard K. Fox was the publisher of the National Police Gazette, one of the most widely read publications in the United States in the 1880s. A weekly newspaper printed on distinctive pink paper that circulated through barbershops and saloons from New York to California, and whose content mixed sensational crime coverage with sports results and entertainment gossip in a format that was roughly the tabloid journalism of its era. Fox had a talent for finding stories that his readership wanted and constructing them into the form his readership found most satisfying, which was considerably more important to his business model than strict factual accuracy. When Belle Starr was shot to death in ambush on a country road near Briartown on February 3, 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, Fox recognized an opportunity. He commissioned a biographical novel built around the few verified facts of her life, significantly augmented by invention, and published Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the female Jesse James in 1889, the same year she died. It sold for 25 cents and reached an enormous audience. Fox's biography gave its readers exactly what they wanted, and almost nothing that had actually happened. Belle Starr, in the Fox version, was beautiful, educated, a Southern aristocrat of refinement and elegance, who turned to crime as an act of passionate revenge for the death of her heroic Confederate officer brother. She was the queen of a gang of outlaws who feared and revered her in equal measure. She rode through Dallas, whooping and firing twin pistols. She had a romantic affair with Cole Younger that produced a daughter. She was the most glamorous criminal the Indian Territory had ever produced. The historian Richard D. Arnott, writing in Wild West magazine in 1997, summarized the gap between this version and the documented reality with a sentence that is worth quoting directly. Belle's true life was one without glamour. The so-called Bandit Queen was actually an unfortunate woman, hardened by her times and associates. The daughter Belle actually produced, Pearl, had her headstone at Younger's Bend engraved with a bell, a star, and a horse. Pearl paid for the headstone with money she earned working in a brothel. That detail does not appear in the Fox biography. The unsolved murder itself is worth examining, because the real circumstances of Belle Starr's death are considerably more complicated and more genuinely mysterious than any fictional outlaw legend the dime novels constructed. She was shot twice from ambush with a shotgun, from behind on a country road about a quarter-mile from her ranch. The attack was premeditated. Someone had waited for her to pass on that specific road and shot her twice, the second time after she had fallen from her horse. Several suspects were investigated. A neighbor named Edgar Watson, with whom she had a dispute, was questioned extensively. Her young husband Jim July, who had reportedly offered $200 to an accomplice to kill her and then threatened to kill her himself when the offer was refused, was questioned. Her son, Ed, with whom she had a violent relationship and whom she had recently beaten badly enough to be a matter of local knowledge, was questioned. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The murder of Belle Starr remains officially unsolved to this day, which means the most dramatic event of her entire life, the one that made her a permanent figure in American popular culture, is the one for which we have the least satisfying historical resolution. The involvement of her daughter Pearl in the aftermath of Belle Starr's death reveals something about the real social world Belle had navigated that the romantic legend consistently obscures. Pearl, whose paternity was never definitively established, grew up in the borderland world her mother inhabited, and after Belle's death she worked in a brothel in Fort Smith. Not as a symbol of degradation, but as a fairly common economic option available to women in that specific time and place who needed income and lacked access to other paths. Pearl used that income to purchase her mother's headstone. She placed a bell and a star on it. She wrote an epitaph that identified her mother by the identity Belle had claimed in life, rather than the more anonymous Myra Maybelle Shirley, who appears in the birth records. The headstone is a document of how a daughter understood her mother's life, not through the Fox biography's Southern Belle narrative, but through the identity her mother had actually built and carried. Pearl herself is not mentioned in most popular retellings of the Belle Starr story, which is consistent with the larger pattern. The real social world of Indian Territory, the real people who inhabited it, and the real economic and social circumstances that shaped Belle Starr's actual life are systematically less interesting to the legend than the invented version, and they get written out of the narrative every time the story gets retold, leaving the Bandit Queen standing alone as a mythological figure, divorced from the people and the place that actually produced her. The irony is sharp. The woman whose legend was built on invented crimes she never committed was killed in an actual, documented crime whose perpetrator was never identified. The Bandit Queen, who never actually robbed a bank, died as a real crime victim whose killer walked away free. The photograph that most people picture when they hear the name Belle Starr is worth a brief examination because it is one of the few verified images of her, and because what it actually shows differs meaningfully from the beautiful Southern belle that Fox's biography described. The photograph, taken in Fort Smith around 1886, shows a woman in her late 30s in a dark dress, seated on horseback, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and what appears to be a gun belt. The expression is not warm. The bearing is direct, unsentimental, and somewhat confrontational in the way that many 19th century photographic subjects appear when they were not accustomed to the conventions of formal portraiture. She is not beautiful in the conventional sense that the dime novels claimed. Contemporaries who met her in person were often surprised by the gap between the description they had encountered in print and the actual woman. Her first husband's family reportedly found her plain. The National Police Gazette, whose illustrations accompanied Fox's biography, portrayed her as an elegant, flowing-haired beauty in melodramatic scenes of outlaw life. Images that had no relationship to the actual photograph available to anyone who looked. This gap between the photograph and the portrait, the actual woman and the invented one, is the visual version of the larger gap that runs through the entire Belle Starr story. A real person, living a real and genuinely difficult life in genuinely difficult circumstances, transformed by the machinery of American popular culture into a character that served the needs of entertainment better than any documented truth about her actual existence ever could. The figure of Judge Isaac Parker, who tried Belle Starr and thousands of other defendants in the Fort Smith courthouse during his tenure from 1875 to 1896, provides useful context for understanding the legal environment in which she operated. Parker became famous as the hanging judge, a reputation built on the 88 executions that took place under his jurisdiction over 2 decades. Modern historians have somewhat complicated this image. Parker operated a court that handled an enormous volume of cases, many of which involved significant violence, and his record on capital punishment was not dramatically out of proportion with the caseload he processed compared to other courts of the period. But the reputation was real enough in his lifetime that appearing before Parker's court was understood throughout the territory as a genuinely serious matter. Belle Starr appeared before Parker's court multiple times. The 1882 horse theft conviction that produced her actual criminal record was one of those appearances. She also faced charges in 1886 twice and was acquitted in both cases. The documentary record of her trials in the Fort Smith criminal case files, preserved in archival collections, is one of the few concrete pieces of primary historical evidence we have about her actual activities, and it consistently shows a woman whose documented criminal exposure was considerably more limited than the legend required. After the Fox biography, the legend accelerated on its own momentum. Films followed in 1928, 1941, 1968, and beyond. Television adaptations, novels, songs. Bob Dylan mentioned her ghost in a 1965 song on Highway 61 Revisited. Emmylou Harris and Mark Knopfler recorded a track named after her in 2006. A Japanese manga series set in the American West included her as a character. Belle Starr appears in comics, video games, and in the ongoing American mythology of the frontier as a ready-made figure for stories about women who refused to accept what their society expected of them. What she actually refused to accept was paying for her horses. The documented record is clear on this. A woman who harbored outlaws and stole horses in the borderlands of Indian Territory, who married men with extensive criminal connections and ran a ranch that provided cover for people running from law enforcement, who spent 6 months in a federal prison in Detroit for a single conviction, and who was shot to death in ambush by person or persons unknown while riding home on a February afternoon in 1889. The legend is larger. The legend always is. But the gap between the legend and the woman is the story worth telling, the story of how a publisher with a talent for giving audiences what they wanted looked at one horse theft and a violent death and saw, correctly, that America was hungry for a female outlaw who did not exist yet, and built one. Whether Belle Starr herself would have recognized the woman Richard K. Fox created from her bones is a question the historical record cannot answer. What it can answer is simpler and more unsettling. The most famous female outlaw in American history may have been, by any measurable criminal standard, considerably less dangerous than the women who simply bought stolen horses. She sold them. If you want the real history behind the Old West legends, subscribe to Lawless Frontier, because next week we go somewhere even darker.